Welcome to Azafi today about climate change and sustainability, and in particular, the management of forests and land management that related to sustainability and climate change. And I have to admit, this is not an area that I know much about. And I'm really looking forward to chatting with Jeremy Van Loon, who is the team outreach leader and communications manager for CIFOR, and I'll let him explain what that is in a moment. But this is something that I think all Canadians need to know more about because we have such a large wilderness. Boreal forest is the largest in the world, et cetera, et cetera. We need to update our information. So Jeremy's going to help us out with that, and welcome to the Zoffy, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Markham. Good to be here.
Now, as I said, I confess my ignorance. So why don't we start with what CIFOR is, the kind of research that it does. And because you're a Canadian, been in Calgary a long time and a former journalist, I'm curious how you got hooked up with CIFOR and why you were interested in that kind of work.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so CIFOR is the Center for International Forestry Research. And the headquarters are based in Indonesia, which is where I'm supposed to be now, but given the pandemic, I came back here several months ago. I'll probably go back later in the year, maybe. And basically, CIFOR looks at sustainable forest management and research. It's an international organization, pretty closely aligned with the UN, and there's it's called the CG network of agricultural and sort of nature research organizations. And a lot of our work is spread mainly across the global south, as it's called. So South America, Africa, Central Africa, and Southeast Asia, although we have some projects that, nudge into the temperate regions. And basically, CIFOR's mandate is to promote sustainable land use, sustainable forestry, improve livelihoods, and everything that goes with that. So from the climate dynamic to food and livelihoods to well-being, economic development, it's sort of all in there in the role that forests and more broadly landscapes can play. I came to CIFOR, I've been there almost about 3 years now, and I had spent many years as a journalist at Bloomberg. Most of that time in Germany. I was in Germany for about 10 years. Writing a lot about the renewable energy transition there. So the policy, the companies that were involved in manufacturing wind turbines and solar panels. Lots of stories about 50 cent per kilowatt hour feed-in tariffs and how great that was. I mean, we all have to thank Germany a little bit for paving the way for making solar so cheap for the rest of us. And then I moved back to Canada after being away for 15, 20 years. Landed in Calgary and started looking more deeply at the fossil fuel industry and covering the oil sands. And then worked for a spell as a policy advisor to the Environment Minister, Shannon Phillips, the climate and energy policy. And I have a master's degree in environmental management, so that's kind of where the connection fits in. So I did do some forestry work and lots of renewable energy stuff. So that's sort of CIFOR in a nutshell. I don't know if you want me to just breeze through sort of a few points I was going to make, or do you want to ask another question?
Well, you know what? I think that breezing through the few points that you have is probably a good way to approach it. So,
okay,
the floor is yours, sir.
Sounds good. So, as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we're focused on is, again, this sort of promotion of sustainable economic development, and a couple of things that I think are really key to note in this dynamic, and it really there is a connection to Canada and the world more broadly. I mean, if you look around the world, there are almost 1 billion people who depend on forests for up to 20% of their livelihoods. It's a huge opportunity and a huge challenge, and I think if we're able to manage these landscapes and forests sustainably, we can really avoid some of the challenges that are coming down the pipeline with climate change, especially. So again, it's a huge opportunity and a big challenge. Interestingly, historically, we've taken forests and landscapes for granted. I mean, most of human economic history has been this very close relationship with forests. From ancient Greece, there are all kinds of stories of populations increasing and getting wealthy from cutting down forests and smelting and burning different metals and creating pottery, and then they run out of forests, the landscape gets degraded and destroyed, the population collapses, and on it goes. So, forests we've always relied on forests significantly up until very recently, in fact. And even if you go, and I'll maybe tell a story later on about some of the time I spent in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's some very interesting stories there. Including Central Africa, what we think of as often primary forests, untouched virgin forests, have actually been logged over for thousands of years. And just to kind of connect what our work is and in the relevance of it, when you look at what's happened with the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a lot of people in a lot of countries that have actually gone back, if you're in West Africa, parts of Southeast Asia to a little lesser extent, who go back to forests, and as they've sort of lost some of their livelihoods and lost income through unemployment or displacement and so on, they go back and they rely on forests. And this if this happens, in a negative way, it can mean, degraded forests and so on. But I guess the bigger question is, why does this matter? Why does it matter for Canada and for the world? And I mentioned the number of people who rely on forests. Obviously, they're a huge source of raw materials, wood, of course, mining, rare earth minerals, palm oil, soy, cattle farming, coffee, and so on. Supply chains of, pretty much every big country or company in the world, could be from Starbucks to Shell, have significant exposure to supply chains that affect forests. And deforestation brings a raft of problems, right? So, including possible pathogens and viruses. In fact, we had some of the research at CIFOR done 2 or 3 years ago, established a link between deforestation and the spread of Ebola. And there's more research that's being done now about, pathways with COVID and other respiratory viruses. So, those are just to name a few. Obviously, there are a number of other ones where you lose ecosystem services and so on. So, typically if we with forests and landscapes, being reductionist humans, we often boil them down to, if you take all of their potential benefits, we often drill down into one resource. So it could be wood, it could be palm oil. So in Indonesia, one of the big challenges that Indonesia's had over the years is, sort of their palm oil industry is like our oil sands industry. It's the source of a lot of conflict. It's the source of a lot of land use challenges. Historically, they have drained peatlands and peat forests to be used as palm oil plantations. It's a $20-25 billion US export industry for them. So it's huge, and it's at that point when we sort of reduce the value of forests to one commodity, to one resource. At the moment, and this sort of comes into the greenhouse gas emission and the climate connection, we're tending to talk a lot about forests as carbon stores, and that's fine. I mean, forests definitely have a huge role to play, in their opportunities for storing carbon and tackling some of the climate change issue. But we have to make sure that we kind of connect all of the different elements and benefits that forests have, to really get the full benefit of it. At the moment, so I was at the climate talks in Madrid back in November or December, and one of the things that kept coming up again and again was this notion of nature-based solutions. So how do you use, landscapes and the oceans, the forests, peatlands to how do we use those effectively, restore them, and use them for carbon capture? And this was a really great trend that we've seen over the last few years, that there's an acknowledgement of using these natural systems for climate change. And of course, Canada's a big part of that too. I can go into that in just a minute. But on the other hand, there's also a bad dynamic to this, because again, sort of, the big fossil fuel producers, they start to look at, these nature-based solutions as, okay, we can pile into that. We can do a lot of work on restoring landscapes, forests, peatlands, and it gives us a little bit of a free pass or a little bit of a breather on, reducing emissions, which is really where we need to go.
Well, hey, let me jump in here.
Yeah.
So if we can put this into Canadian context for just a little bit, and
Yeah.
got a couple of farmers on here, so they'll be very interested to know your views on land management and soil management as a means of sequestering carbon. And you give us a little bit of an overview on that from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in any of this. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot is, there are a lot of techniques, and your listeners there will have much more experience with this than I would. But sort of no-till farming, for example, is one. Where you can have maintain carbon levels in the soil, and again, it really depends on the kind of soils that you're working with, the kind of climate that you're in. I mean, in Indonesia, one of the issues is that, you have a lot of these peatland areas, right? And so they'll drain peatlands, and obviously, when you drain peatlands, it just, the depth can go up to about 10 meters of these very, very, very carbon rich soils. So you drain those things, and you lose that, and it goes into the atmosphere. Obviously, it'd be very different from farming up in Leduc or around Edmonton. Completely different dynamic. But that's probably one thing. Another thing that increasingly that we work on, certainly in kind of these developing tropical areas, is agroforestry. And agroforestry, there's a lot of work being done at the moment on coffee plantations and companion planting, if you will, I guess, with different kinds of trees. So you get the benefit of shade, which helps the coffee bushes, that protects them a bit against some of the ravages of a warming climate, for example, soil moisture maintenance and that kind of thing. So I guess those are some of the elements that sort of come to mind when we talk about the farming and land use. But again, I'm not an expert in that.
Right. Now, we keep hearing, stories in North America about the deforestation of the Amazon, for instance, and I hadn't heard about the peat fields in Indonesia, but it seems to be all of a piece. Is there work being done? Is there a movement in the South to reclaim some of this land from a sustainability point of view and as a means to sequester carbon? Is that where we're going, or is it a way, are those lands lost to coffee plantations and other forms of agriculture, and we're not getting them back?
No, there are a lot of different initiatives. I mean, to Indonesia's credit, the current president, Jokowi, is he's very much in favor, and has done a lot actually in terms of trying to reclaim peatlands. I mean, it's an ongoing piece of work, and unfortunately, Indonesia, as one example, has lost a lot. In the Congo, there's an incredible store of peat that we only actually discovered about it might be like 5, 6, 7 years ago. There was a researcher from the UK who just discovered these incredibly huge, I think it's 30 gigatons of carbon stored in Central Africa. And so there are a lot of different initiatives, but like a lot of things with restoration, and I was going to show you a little slide, but give you the numbers. I mean, the world needs to be investing probably $300 to $400 billion a year minimum to restore these areas, and there's just a huge gap, right? A lot of the problem is that the private sector is largely in the north, and then they're engaged in the south in different ways, resource extraction often. Governments don't really have any money there. That was a big part of the Kyoto Protocol, right? Is that it was this perceived wealth transfer. But in fact, if you do it right, it should be remunerative and profitable for all sides. But yes, to answer your question, lots happening. Just more needs to be funded.
Can you give me a story or two, maybe a success story from the work that CIFOR does?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so a couple small ones that I can think of. And I know this probably drifts quite far from where your, some of your listeners and your readers are focused on. But we had this project. One of the things that we work on a lot is, sort of in parts of the global south and Africa, gender is a big issue. So women are just completely excluded from a lot of things that we in Canada would assume, like, why would you do that? We had a project in Uganda where the women weren't allowed to own land, they're not allowed to own trees, they're not allowed to farm. And we had a project where we brought the community together, and they somehow managed to turn around those attitudes. And of course, obvious examples. So that, after a couple of years, the women were allowed the right to plant trees and to grow, I think they were growing mangoes and other things. And, sure enough, like 40% increase in productivity. I mean, it's these kind of very basic things that you would assume, but actually it takes a lot of work to go into places like that and turn things around. We have another really interesting project in the Democratic Republic of Congo that is in the middle of the north of the country, and there's this biosphere reserve, and we're developing sort of economic systems so that people don't go in. I mean, there are about 1 million people that live around this reserve, and they go into the forest and kind of extract pretty much everything that's of value. And so we've worked with the local community in the European Union to build like nurseries for plantations, poluticulture, so where you use fishing, fish with different plant species, and this is actually having some, there's definitely some benefits there. You see much less deforestation happening, but it's a long-term project. I mean, the DRC is an example of a country that is there's some work to do there.
Now, I'm old enough to remember the Green Revolution in Latin America and how the promise of that in the 50s and the devastation that it caused, the unintended consequences that we discovered after we were well into sending farm equipment and chemicals down to economies and cultures that had no experience with them. Are we seeing any of that, or are we smarter now in the 2010s and 2020s than we were 50, 60 years ago?
We definitely know a lot more now. I mean, we have the knowledge. I mean, this is the thing. We know a lot more than we did then. Is that knowledge being applied across the board? Unfortunately not. And so this is, one of the things where, there are examples upon examples of being in places with extremely degraded landscapes where, people are relying, like Ethiopia, for example. I can't remember the number, but it's, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80 to 90% of the population are subsistence farmers, basically. And just by dint of the fact that Ethiopia now has 100 million people, I mean, there's enormous pressures on landscapes there. And so there are all kinds of things you can do to make that landscape more productive. And it's, farmers are the same in Ethiopia as they are in Alberta, as they are in, South Dakota. I mean, smart people, and they know how to, they understand their land. But, when you get these additional pressures and they don't have the tools at their disposal, especially with mobile technology and stuff, there's a lot you can do there. So have we learned? Yes, but are we applying it? Not as much as we could be.
Well, we're getting close to the last question here. So folks, I see we have one little blue hand up already. So if you want to ask a question when we get to the Q&A, if you could go in where it says participants at the bottom of your video screen, and if you could click on the question, a little blue hand will pop up in my list, and then when we get to Q&A, I will call on you to unmute your mic and ask your question. So, Jeremy, what kind of lessons has CIFOR learned that could be applied to Canada, particularly the prairies?
Well, I think probably some of the lessons that would be, that would be valuable would be sort of going back to that first point that I made. And I think there's a lot of work in Canada that we could do on this idea of like integrated land use management, which is one sort of key phrase, or another way to describe it is called the landscape approach. But basically where you look at a landscape. And so here I'm sitting now in Calgary, and, to the west, you've got the mountains, and to the east, you've got a lot of very productive farms. And everything, and then there's a big city in between. And so, one of the really effective ways of managing a larger regional land use is, you bring together all the different people who are using that land. And we're doing that in large part now. I mean, there's a lot that's happening, but we could probably, expand that. So, the people upstream who are focused on tourism, and then the people downstream, especially, farmers using a lot of the water from the Boat River, for example, in the years to come, as we start experiencing, fluctuations in water volumes, bringing all of those different stakeholders together and figuring out more often how you can sort of integrate all of the, from the mountains to the fields, so to speak, and through the city, how it all fits together.
What about the idea of sequestering carbon in soils? Are there any lessons from Indonesia and the south that could be applied in, say, Alberta and Saskatchewan, where you get a lot of grain farming?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, we have a pretty successful recipe here, it seems, like in terms of the agriculture that we have. And I think, everything I've ever read about, farmers in Alberta, I mean, again, super smart people, totally, understand all of the different components at stake. They know, what's, the latest technology and if it's going to work for them. I guess just given the climate here, it's obviously you don't get 3 harvests, right, every year. I mean, you get shot at one, unlike in Indonesia. But I think, just again, not what the work that we're doing, but you see a lot of these, sort of no-till things, and you see a lot more technology being used, I guess, around, predicting, changes in weather. That's probably some of the low-hanging fruit. I don't know, I'd have to give it a little bit more thought about how to apply some of those possible learnings from the global south.
Well, the good news is I know we have at least one farmer who will be full of ideas for you. We'll get to him in just a moment. So Brian Wincherick, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question of Jeremy, please.
I just wondering what you were talking about gender, and I know like in developing countries, women spend most of their time collecting firewood because of the they need to cook with, and I think that's so. And I know there was one South African company that developed what is called the Wonder Bag, which is a slow cooker that doesn't use electricity. Are you guys helping out in any way of developing techniques for cutting down the time for collecting wood for cooking or anything like that?
Yeah, there are a couple of projects that I'm not super familiar with, but we tend to get more. We tend to sort of be a little bit more on the policy side of things, and so we'll work with stakeholders, companies, governments that are bringing those things together so that we can kind of create the appropriate conditions. But I mean, that's an excellent example. I mean, if it's not firewood, it's hauling water in a lot of places too, and that's I mean, just such a tragedy to have to spend so much time doing that.
And I also like, sometimes you get a lot of trees that are, Europeans like to introduce things that shouldn't be introduced in some areas. Like in the Bahamas, they have casuarina trees, which are beautiful, nice, fast growing bush, like green all the time, but they also push into, they're killing off the native trees. And there's that problem. And like, so you got government spending lots of money trying to control these weeds.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting, I was going to bring that up too, this whole, the tree planting movement, which is great in some ways, right? Like plant 1 trillion trees, but it's a lot more complicated. And I think you just alluded to one of the challenges there. I mean, you got to get the right species in the right place and how you do it, et cetera, et cetera. So very, very good point.
Okay, if Brian Heidecker, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Well, I could probably start a lecture here, but anyway, and that. So I think I'll focus on the soil, the organic matter. So if you go back, so as Markham indicated, 1965, 1970 was probably the worst condition that the prairie soils were in. Because of farming practices, et cetera, et cetera. Since the adoption of no-till, which was all predicated around the ability to use the Roundup platform, going to minimum till, prairie soils right now are back to the fertility level that they were in the 1900s and that. So it's very different. And it's certainly very different than, for example, in the Corn Belt in the U.S., but that's a policy-driven thing here. But the prairie soils are back to the original fertility that they were, and that sort of thing. And so, but it comes back to the problem with subsistence agriculture is you can't you don't have the ability, and we've got what, about 2% of our population in the farming sector, feeding everybody, I might add, and that. So it's really changed on that. But my question is around palm oil. And those palm oil plantations were put there. Many of them were financed by Europeans. My understanding is that the palm oil is going into often into fuel as a replacement for fuel. And I, for one, think it's absolutely appalling that we are using, like we have food grains, we have fuel grains, or feed grains, and then we now have fuel grains. And I think it's appalling that we're taking high quality stuff to make gasoline and stuff like that. Now, is it correct that a lot of that palm oil is getting used? So it basically, the Europeans are saying, well, out of sight, out of mind, we're doing real good, and that's the Indonesians' problem?
Well, there was quite a big, there was some legislation that was passed late last year by the European Union on sort of restricting palm oil in certain contexts. And the Europeans did something similar in Brazil kind of about a decade ago, roughly, where there was a lot of deforested oils from trees coming, palm included, coming into the EU for biodiesel. And they, especially around this kind of 2007, 2008 period. And they kind of cracked down on that. I mean, I'm sure it's still making its way in. I mean, with palm oil, it's largely, I mean, you don't find it here that much. And it's interesting how much of a staple it is for cooking. In fact, here, an interesting anecdote is how, if you go back like 2 or 3 generations, there was very little deep fried food in Indonesia. And in the last 2 generations, they have just started using palm oil for everything. I mean, everything there, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of the food is deep fried now. And it's because of the availability of palm oil. I don't know what the percentage is off the top of my head of it that ends up in fuels, but I don't think it's a huge amount at this point in time. But it's an interesting dynamic there to consider.
Well, Jeremy, I'm curious about this. We often, and again, getting back to my views of countries like Indonesia and so on were formed, at a time when we thought of economies like that as third world. And is that still the case, or are these economies quite developed and able now to make a transition to better technology, better science, better management practices that maybe wouldn't have been possible 50, 60, 70 years ago?
I mean, I think it's all, I mean, it's really different. I mean, Indonesia, like, let's compare Indonesia in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, Indonesia is, I guess they say, a lower middle income country, right? So per capita GDP of, $2,000 to $3,000 a year. If you're in Jakarta, I mean, it looks like any other big city. There are lots of BMWs and everything. And, even when you go out into the countryside, there are lots of signs of development. The economy is growing, 5 to 7% a year. But interestingly, you don't see a lot of solar panels. You don't see a lot of wind turbines. They have a state-run electricity company. And, I mean, as Albertans, a lot of the Albertan companies here in the oil and gas industry have been active down there. Husky was there. Former Talisman was down there. Nexon, I think. So, they have a pretty robust oil and gas industry. And I think, unfortunately, despite, the fact that if they built out solar a lot there, I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But in that sense, there's not a lot of excess investment money available. And there are, like in every country, more or less, there are sort of perverse subsidies for the wrong things in a lot of cases. So they deal with that. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, to sort of show the other end of the spectrum, I mean, that's, people have called it a failed state. I mean, it's kind of a mess, unfortunately. Beautiful country. I mean, people obviously amazing, talented, like everywhere else in the world, but years and years of misgovernance, and there's just so far to go, right? Where do you start? I mean, when I was there the last time, we had to drive about 100 kilometers. It took all day along this hiking trail, and you go through village after village after village. And I'm like the elder, I'm 48 years old, and I'm like the oldest guy in the circumference of 5 kilometers. I mean, it's a very young country, a huge potential, but it's so far to go.
Well, Jeremy, this will be kind of a last question, but any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess the one thing I think is a nice final message is just, let's try to think about these landscapes and forests as, we rely on all of these things for so much. And if we can just think of all their diverse benefits, instead of just, one commodity, whether it's wood or palm oil or other things, I think it'll be good for us here domestically to do that more. And then it helps, it just helps the world at large, basically, if you get, countries like DRC and Indonesia and others to develop sustainably, so that, they can kind of do their thing and they don't have to go through the model that we went through that was so heavily dependent on fossil fuels.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate this, and good luck with your work with CIFOR.
Thanks very much, Markham. It was a pleasure.